at our second sermon in a 5-week preaching series on the ethics of James Luther Adams, an early to mid 20th century Unitarian Harvard professor who was committed to combating the rise of Nazism, both abroad and home. Today we're going to take a circuitous route today through a few stories that all touch upon his second of 5 stones, which is it's in a later editor's reference to the David and Goliath story, where 5 stones, an oppressive attacker, an army, was beaten back by a kid with a sling in the Jewish scripture. That second stone goes, relationships between people ought to be free. Mutuality and consent are both ethical and theological principles. So the first story, a few years back, pre-pandemic, I attended 10 days of working conferences for religious professionals, mostly educators. One part of those conferences was primarily about having difficult conversations. How do we as leaders, how do we as religious people have the difficult conversations around the big topics? Money, race, death, sexuality. I was also asked to lead a part of the workshops around race, identity, and racism. Not surprisingly, the week started with the comparatively easy, topic of money, and not surprisingly saved sexuality for the last day. One of the premises of the conference was that we needed to understand our frameworks around each of these topics if we were to have the difficult conversations within our own communities of faith. Where we start from when we're thinking about race or death has a big or even bigger impact than any set of factors or subset of knowledge on the topics. What's our story about money or sexuality, and how do we tell it? One of the odd standouts for a very unusual conference for religious professionals was realizing that if something happened to me, my husband would have a hard time figuring out where all of my investments or retirement portfolios are, what my bank account, and so on. It's something we're still, maybe 10 years later, working on fixing. But it taught me something about myself that I hadn't quite realized. Part of me is still living, in some ways, a story of individuality. Relationships between people ought to be free. Mutuality and consent are both ethical and theological principles. Don't get me wrong, almost everything that affects our household goes through a rigorous schedule of fretting and arguing, like any very happily married couple. But there are some habits of the single years that I haven't put to rest. Even now, 8 years into our married life, and 13 years together, shared documentation, shared calendars, and negotiating where we go for Thanksgiving and Christmas all still trip us up. How do we start a shared Google Calendar has become a seasonal refrain in our household, despite all of our tech savvy. I find it just onerous, one more thing to figure out and do. Individuality runs deep in our culture, and it's a hard practice to unlearn. And I don't think I'm alone here on that. Another side of individuality is isolation. We all live in isolation at some time in our lives, even if we're surrounded by people all the time. I mean, we just went through 3 years of a pandemic where I think many of us were sequestered for the first 2 years, easily. And we don't have to be alone in isolation. It's another story we tell ourselves. How alone are we? We can become most aware of it when we're going through times of crisis, of course, whether or not we have all the communal support we can ever dream of. How we relate to crisis can determine if we tell our story as individuals or tell our story as part of something larger. Do we fight that struggle with cancer as lone warriors? Or do we let ourselves lean on our friends and neighbors for moral support, even knowing still that we are the ones that have to go in for chemo? When our relationships wither, do we reach out or do we hunker down? Having good friends and family, even when we have many of them, doesn't necessarily mean we let them in when the road gets rough. Everyone has a different personality, response, reaction to those times. Sometimes that might be the right choice. Only you know the answer for yourself, but sometimes we think isolation is the best choice, even when it's not. Second story. I was listening to an interview with a comedian some of you may know, Patton Oswalt. No one? He was being interviewed on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, so he is known. At the time, he was a man in his mid to late 40s with a 7-year-old daughter. His wife suddenly died in her sleep. There was no warning. She had been working very long hours, and he finally convinced her to stay home and get some sleep. There was an accidental and very tragic dose of sleeping medication. He's been very public with his grief, and he took a long break from his work in comedy. Something he said about grief in the interview really struck me as true. To quote, "If you don't talk about it, then grief really gets to set up and fortify its positions inside of you and begin to immobilize you. But the more you talk, the more you expose it to the air and to the light, then grief doesn't get the chance to organize itself. And maybe you can move on better and easier. Grief can't be remedied, must be endured, and it's the endurance, oddly enough, that becomes the remedy." He goes on to talk about how he's found that not only has talking about his grief with others helped him to move forward with his life as an individual and then as a widowed dad of a young child, but he's learned that his sharing has helped others in extreme grief find avenues for healing. Speaking our stories has a healing power that can help us get back to living more fully after times of great loss. Relationships between people ought to be free. Mutuality and consent are both ethical and theological principles. Third story. This reminds me of the old folk saying about twigs. Take any twig you find and try to snap it. It breaks pretty easily. Put that same twig in a bundle with other twigs and it gets harder and harder to break. I think when we separate ourselves too long from one another, from community, from friends, from congregation, we become like that singular twig. Life's pressures can become too much. Grief or loss can become too much, and we don't have to do it alone. Alone or together, the story we tell about our life changes us. British fiction author Terry Pratchett. Some people know Terry Pratchett? Okay, great. The rest of you have homework to do. He's a great comedic writer. He says, people think that stories are shaped by people. In fact, it's the other way around. Well, we're all a people of story or stories. Most of my sermons start by telling another type of story, basically parables of daily living. This sermon itself is a series of stories. For us, we don't have to imagine being a people of story as much as consciously realize how deeply stories impact our lives and our living. What are the stories you come back to year after year? What stories do you raise our kids on, and why? Which stories define your character or pull on your heartstrings or get you in the gut when they resonate with what's happening in your life? As Pratchett writes, people are shaped by stories. We should choose our stories wisely. And we should choose the stories we tell about our lives just as wisely. Whatever negative story do you choose to try to convince yourself is true about you? We all at times in our life do that. Anyone that survived middle school has done it at least once. I spoke about separation and isolation before, but there are many other stories we tell about ourselves that harm more than help. Fourth story. Some time ago, a colleague of mine was sharing a story about their congregation on Facebook, and I have permission to share this. He wrote, one thing that I never expected to be quite so good at, helping calm really little kids down who are missing their parents. I wonder if this is sort of an inherent knowledge that came when I was hired as a director of religious ed, or if it was there all along. Excuse me. On one level, there's a story we all tell about our capacity to be in the world, what we're good at, what we're bad at, and what our roles are in our lives. But on the spiritual level, his story reminded me about the central purpose of communities of faith. And I don't say this flippantly. All religious life is essentially helping one another struggle through our separation anxiety, our sense of separation from the holy, from God, from one another. In times of grief, we remember those who have died in our lives. And in times of change, we hold one another's hands to remember we're not alone. In the everyday, or maybe for you, only a few times in your life, we struggle with whether there's meaning and depth in this world, whether we're part of something greater. For some, the answer is community, or compassion, or justice building, maybe all three. For the more mystical among us, I believe we're never truly alone, but despair sets in when we forget that truth. Religious life is helping one another through our struggle with separation and isolation, through grief and loss. And the other side of that struggle is a question of the Spirit, and an answer that draws us back out again and again. Fifth story. I'm going to try out a new metaphor. This is the parable of the chili bake. I hope this will explain all things. Social media is sometimes an odd place to be in my friendship circle. One Midwestern colleague was talking about the sounds and looks of horror in a New York City deli when she asked to put lox on a cinnamon raisin bagel. And further out west, a bunch of my Texas friends and colleagues were talking half seriously, but very half seriously, about Texas state politics and a recent accusation at the time that a certain candidate, who will remain nameless here, puts beans in his chili. There were gasps and comments of, well, this is getting dirty now, isn't it? And then enters this Jersey boy New Yorker who slowly raises his hand and asks, if you don't put beans in your chili, what do you put in your chili? Insert more gasps from the Texans. Two Texas colleagues came to my rescue and explained what their beanless chili is, how to my Italian ear, what they were describing was actually just spice sauce. No, they said. There's too much meat in there for it to be sauce. Which sounded like we were talking about hamburger helper to me, which produced more gasps, and not a few sighs. No, it's straight beef, not ground meat, and on and on. I recall saying that, wow, it's like we use the same words, but they have different meanings. Then one saint stepped in and performed what I will call the chili exegesis, Reverend Joanne Fontaine Crawford. She explained the authenticity answer: chili is cowboy food. On long cattle drives, you didn't have room to carry a lot of supplies, certainly not beans. The Texan foodie answer: properly made chili has no need of beans. It's not like what passes for chili in other places, just minus the beans. It's usually slow cooked for hours and is full of chilies and spices and good meat, not ground beef. And you want to taste that without the filler of beans. In a proper bowl of Texas red, you can stick your wooden spoon in the middle of the pot and it will stand straight up with no help because it's that thick. Practical answer: in Texas, chili isn't just one dish. Chili is an ingredient. It's thinned and poured over enchiladas, thick and added to hot dogs, used to make Frito pie. You can eat the beans on the side. It's almost as if we're using the same words, but they mean different things. And they're both still chili, just a chili that addresses the answers for the people in the place where they are, whether that answer be a cowboy food, an ingredient in another more elaborate dish, or an entree on its own. As my theology professor, Dr. James Cone, would often repeat, theology is how we make and understand meaning in the world. Each community, each people is going to wrestle with the answers and questions before them in their own way. And yes, it is still wrong to put lox on a cinnamon raisin bagel in New York. Relationships between people ought to be free. I made a choice in this sermon to focus on the everyday side of the second stone of James Luther Adams. A bunch of stories about everyday togetherness, silliness, mutuality, and daily free exchange of ideas, stories, and life. Consent would be a series of sermons all on its own, and we'll get to that over the years. But I made the choice to focus on the everyday, right relationship side of this message because we all could benefit from honing in on how to rebuild that when we don't all see the world the same way. And we don't all see the world the same way. Relationships, rebuilding relationships that understand what mutuality means when we don't all understand the world in the same way. As the news daily shows us. Amen and blessed be.